Please tell us if you're in the back, if you can't hear us. I have a very theatrical voice, so usually that's not a problem. Hey, Jason Langer. But we want to make sure that everyone can hear if possible. Adrain, wasn't I Have Something to Tell You shown here the first time?
Yes, actually. Well, in the old location. And it was the first exhibit of my work that meant something and made me feel like I was an actual artist, that I was a photographer, and that I was being seen and understood. And really, it's all thanks to meeting Chris Rauschenberg in Houston. And yeah.
What year was that?
I don't know. Chris.
Rough idea?
I'm bad with dates. Like 20 years ago?
Was it after I met you?
No.
Okay, it was before that.
Yeah.
So I saw this body of work, I Have Something to Tell You, which is on view in the book room in the far back. In the middle of the street in Santa Fe. I just want to sort of we're going to talk a lot about relationships, but I also want to, in this very beautiful space, with a very formal presentation of work, I also want to sort of lay some groundwork for, there's a long road from where we often start to being here. So I met Adrain in Santa Fe toward the end of a portfolio review that was happening there. Our mutual friend, Tim Ride, was very insistent that we meet each other, even if it was very briefly. So I was heading to the airport, and we were stopped on a side street, and Adrain opened up the trunk of his car, and he showed me prints of I Have Something to Tell You. And that was, the reason I was asking is because that was like 2003.
Okay.
The first year that I went to Santa Fe. So that's why I was just curious what the timing of that was. But yeah, it's, that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
That was a long time. But it stuck with me because I published it 15 years later or so. Which is about the normal time frame. Sometimes it takes that long.
Yeah.
You have to really think about things for a long time. We're just going to kind of dive in. We have a few topics that we established were important that we wanted to talk about, and also we'll make some space, a lot of space for questions that you may have. But I think to get us started, this exhibition is at Blue Sky largely because of Adrain's encouragement, and on Blue Sky's side and also on my side. So why did you think this should be here?
Why did I think it should be here? Well, when I first read Seeing, Being Seen, when I first had it and read it, and I had this realization that as a photographer, I live, breathe photography. It's my everything, it's my passion. And I think most photographers are like that. It's sort of like, it's the way they are. And we often, or I'll say me, because it's been my experience, sort of think of people who are publishers or gallerists or curators. They have this sort of 9-to-5 relationship with photography. It's just this general notion I had, right? Not really contemplating it. It was just a sort of notion. But once I read Seeing, Being Seen, I was like, oh, these people have these deep relationships that are as deep or maybe even deeper than mine, even if they're not photographers, to photography and to photographers. And so I thought it just illuminated this whole other side to photography when people devote their life to photography and what their relationship is. And so Seeing, Being Seen was like this sort of aha moment. And I've been to your house, so I was I've seen all these on your wall before. And even then, even knowing that you live with them, in this very intimate way, the actual holding that book and reading that book, realizing oh, this is it was an aha moment for me. So I thought in the Blue Sky, that notion of teaching about photography, I thought it would be because it's such an expansive show of work. You know what I mean? The history of photography is sort of on the walls in a way. So I asked you, I encouraged you to think about submitting. to the exhibition committee.
First thing I said was, that sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah.
Because then I have to take them off the walls. And you were with me, well, so there was one previous time in my life that I had taken all the photographs off the walls. And Adrain had come over right before then because it was the first time that you were in the house seeing everything. Mm-hmm. And my friend Sylvia Plahi, who is represented in almost every room in here, sometimes multiple times in the same room. Yeah, she's there and there and there and in there. Sylvia said, well, maybe you need to just take the pictures down. Maybe you need to like clear your palette and refresh your mind and start over. There's a lot of starting over in that moment. And so Adrain said, well, I haven't actually been to your house. So he came over, we walked through, we spent a couple hours just like looking at what was on the walls and talking. And then after he left, I started taking everything down. And the first visceral realization was that when the photographs are not on the wall, when they are in a pile against the wall, they're very small. Mm. Like, they don't physically consume nearly as much physical space or emotional space when they are just in a little pile against the wall. So I took everything down in my house. And then I wept for like 3 hours. And I was like, this is a terrible idea. This is a very bad idea. And I immediately put back up, I told somebody asked me this on Thursday, and I said 3 prints, but it was actually 4 because I'm looking at Barbara Morgan. I immediately actually that night I just left myself in the fetal position, and I think I probably slept on the floor. And then the next morning, I put Barbara Morgan's Martha Graham back up. I put a Robert Adams print I no longer own back up. I put Sylvia Plahi's Swan's Way, which is in the altar room, back up. And I put Nude Foot, Minor White's print, back up. And I did live with only those works on the wall for about 6 months. And it felt like a strange kind of fasting. And every day I would be like, I hate this. And then I was like, it's my choice. I am doing this to myself. But I felt like I needed to sort of try this duration of living without the work. And then after about 3 months, I had a conversation with Sylvia, and she said, I think that original thing I said to you was maybe not such a good idea. You've been very sad every time I've talked to you since then. I was trying to make you less sad. I think I made you more sad. But it was a good experience because I had started to take things for granted. I had started to not see. And that experience and that kind of desperation and longing to see the prints again was very important. And then I had a similar experience during COVID when we couldn't go to museums. We couldn't go to galleries. We couldn't go anywhere. And I was profoundly grateful that I had work at home to spend time with. And I really spent time with the work, which was also why the book went from a 32-page blurb catalog that I intended to make for myself to a 176-page book that is out in the world. It really was that. It was thinking about relationships. Mm-hmm. Do we want to talk about your piece?
Sure.
Too soon?
That's up to you.
Other than that, we have to talk about living histories. Do you want to talk about Rosalind for a minute?
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, so
that feels
Yeah, why not? So when Michelle and I started, when she finally said, okay, I'll submit it to Blue Sky, we had lots of conversations about what would it really be saying more than like somebody's collection on the wall. Like what should it talk about? And we talked a lot about relationship and like, what's her relationship to the photographs, like you just spoke about, or what's your relationship to the photographers? What's the relationship between the photographers? Like seeing Minor White's foot on her wall was this like moment for me because he was such a force and such an enigma to me, and to then actually be seeing the print on the wall, it was so moving. And also, you had a Wojnarowicz at the time that just blew me away. So there's that experience. And also Sylvia Plahy was like a hero to me. And to have that like relationship. And then when she had this response to the photograph that we made, and she made that photograph in response to that photograph, it was like this like wow moment. It's like, at any rate, where am I going? I'm going way off topic.
No, but that's a good, I mean, that's...
So we're talking about relationships.
And living histories.
And living histories, and I've been contemplating a lot about that, like coming to this. And I guess it's been 2 weeks now. My first mentor passed away. Her name was Rosalind Solomon. And she was a difficult woman. And she was a brilliant photographer, but she was difficult. And I was contemplating our first meeting, which was, it was like in the early 90s. I was in my 20s. I came back to New Orleans from being in New York for the summer. And I was like, in my early 20s, I was completely broke. And one way you could make money if you were a young queer man was to work for this guy named Harold. And Harold sold plants. And you could work at his greenhouse for $50 a day, which $50 in New Orleans in the early 90s was like, that would get you by. You would have a good time. And so the first day I worked for Harold, he was asking me about myself, and I told him I was a photographer, and I just came back from New York. And he asked me, he goes, do you know who Rosalind Solomon is? And I'm like, no, I have no idea. And he goes, well, I delivered some plants to her apartment, and she has this photograph on her wall of a woman nursing a lamb. He goes, you know, you should call her and see if you could work for her. And I'm like, okay, that's a good idea. So I call her up, and I said, you know, would you like to meet for coffee? And so we met at my favorite cafe of all time, a place called Caldi's on Decatur Street, New Orleans. And the first thing she said to me was, how did you get my phone number? And I was like, the phone book? And she goes, oh. She goes, and then I don't even remember what the conversation was after that, other than I was just like, I'm like, I want to be done with this. I want to be. And I had taken a box of photographs because I was young and naive. I didn't know what, you know, working for a photographer meant, because I'd never worked for a photographer. I didn't know what she would want. But here I was with a box of photos. And she's kind of staring at me, and she like acknowledges the box, and she goes, I need you to know one thing. I don't need any passionate young photographers working for me. I just need someone to carry my bags. And I was like, okay. And then she said, well, since you brought them, you should let me look at your photos. And I was like, absolutely not. And I stood up and I was like, hell no. I'm like, have a nice life. And then I was like, you know, you don't have to be such a bitch. And I turned and left. And then it was probably like a couple of months, I was just kind of hanging out, and she popped in my head. And I was thinking, I'm like, that poor woman, she needs a friend. I'm like, I'm just gonna call her up and invite her out to go have a drink and just like not talk about photography, you know, just a friend thing. And as I'm thinking this, she calls me and she goes, you know what, I think I need your help. And so that was like the actual start of the relationship, but it was contentious. The relationship was always contentious, but the things she taught me were amazing. Mostly she told me how to not be an asshole because of her experiences being difficult. And she wrote me a letter telling me this about how that at the start of her career, it was taking off, and she was so difficult that it just sort of crashed. And I'm thrilled that at least the last, 10, 20 years,
yeah.
she got the recognition and that she really deserved. And she taught me, though, how to be fearless and how to, even if you have fear, to do the work that you have to do. So that was so I've been thinking about her a lot. So, and relationships, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Adrain was asking me earlier if I had similar contentious experiences that shifted. It's very important to me to acknowledge that Ken Barron and Debbie are here from New York. Ken's father, Steve Barron, was my professor in graduate school. And I had him for a class on book production and design my very first semester at Pace. I was 21 years old, and his class was on a Friday night. And my friends, I was always like the last person to leave the classroom because I always had another question to ask him. And my friends would be like, we're gonna lose our spot at the Italian restaurant, the one, it's the place you can bring your own wine, so the pastas are only $5, and if we don't get there, we're not gonna be able to have dinner tonight. And Steve was very patient with me, and at the same time, there were points at which he was like, go out into the world and learn more. I'm not the only person you can learn from. And so we got to the end of the class, and I was very, very anxious that I hadn't learned everything from him that I needed to learn. And most of the professors in the publishing program were adjunct. They were working full time. They would teach a class a year, maybe 2 classes a year, a class every other year. So I was like, once he's out of my purview, that knowledge is gonna disappear. And I cannot allow that to happen. And so the last week of class, he's like, okay, I'm gonna make a deal with you. Put together a list of all of your outstanding questions. Meet me for lunch there was a beautiful cafe at the Morgan Library when it was still a very small spot, and it was across the street from one of his 2 day jobs. He's like, I'm gonna answer your questions over lunch. And then he was like, just to be clear, we're probably not gonna see each other after that. So be thorough in your list. So I'm like, okay, great. And then I'm like, actually, what I really need is for him to advise my thesis, and then he has to work with me for the next 1.5 years. And that is the most important question I need to ask. So get to lunch, we order, it was very fancy. I was not used to things that were so fancy, and kind of feeling a little intimidated. And he was like, okay, what's your let's start. What's your first question? And I said, I only have one question. And he rolled his eyes. And then I said, will you work with me on my thesis for the next year? And he sighed in a way that I didn't think anyone could until I met Michael Hoffman, who sighed like that regularly. It was a long, deep, genuine sigh. And he said, I have to think about that. And I got a letter from him about, almost a month later. And he said, you're gonna have to work, if you are asking this of me, you're gonna have to work. So are you willing to work? And I was like, absolutely. And I still have all of the notes that he wrote. His notes sometimes were the same length as the chapters that I would send him. But that was the beginning of a very important 14-year relationship. He went on to hire me at Aperture. We continued to work together on projects after he retired from Aperture. And you don't know, right? You don't know in that moment where those relationships will go, how they will evolve. Steve, when he hired me at Aperture, he also really sat me down and said, you are not gonna make a lot of money. You will probably never own a home. He asked if I was interested in having a family. He was very clear on the challenges of a creative life. Working for a nonprofit organization, working for a place that held very high ideals that you kind of came into. But he also said, which has definitely been true and is evidenced here, you will have a very interesting life and you will meet really extraordinary people. It will come at a cost. But here it is, child. Choose your path. And Steve was also always guiding me into the books that he thought were going to be worth money. You should have this book. Like, this book will never reprint. Try to get a copy, try to, whenever we're getting rid of books from whatever, the library or the basement, or, make sure you get that book. Or he is the person who pushed me to negotiate when Michael Hoffman, who's a longtime executive director at Aperture, he was there for 35 years, Michael would hire a designer, get mad at them, fire the designer, and then say, because I was the in-house person, like, Michelle, you should pick up this newsletter, pick up this jacket, pick up this whatever person he just fired, whatever they were working on. And Steve finally said, he was planning to pay that other person money. You should ask for money. And I'm like, I'm not, Aperture has no money. That was ingrained in me early. Aperture has no money. And he said, well, then you should ask for prints. You should ask for prints in trade. And so Wire Wheel, which is behind C, was the very first time that I had the courage to negotiate with Michael. And I had gotten to know him well enough at that point that I understood that he really was an aesthete and a man of taste. And so we negotiated for, I think, $2,000. And the intermediary, the development person, was doing all of this back and forth thing. And so I said, okay, here's my list of like 6 different gravures and less expensive things that add up to like $1,900. So that's an option. And then the other option is Wire Wheel, which was $2,500. And she said, well, that's more than the dollar value that Michael agreed to. And I said, I know that, but Michael loves Paul Strand. And Michael, I think, is gonna think I'm smart if I'm choosing a Paul Strand photograph, and I think he's gonna want me to have the Paul Strand photograph, and he's gonna forego the $500 in trade. And she's like, I don't know about this. And I was like, look, if he doesn't, I get 6 other gravures. It's like no harm, no foul. I'm winning either way. And she comes back after talking to him, and she was genuinely surprised. And she was like, he agreed to the Strand. I was like, yes. And then Michael wrote me a handwritten note saying, you owe me $500 worth of additional work. Yeah. But learning how to negotiate was important. And I think for me, coming into Aperture at that, I was 22 when I started freelancing there. I was 23 when I was hired full time. And I was sitting at the table with people who threw around names like Paul Strand, Minor White, first name basis, Cole Weston, Edward Weston, Barbara Morgan. this was all very like blasé to them. These were humans to them. And I was like, I have a whole new pantheon of gods and goddesses I have to get to know here. And that was extraordinary. Like, it was extraordinary to know that these icons were humans to someone. They were definitely not humans to me. They were icons to me, but they were humans to someone. They were humans to humans that I knew. And I think one of the joys of we're still alive. We've gotten to live long enough that people that we know as humans are icons to others. And to be able, I think ultimately for me, that's one of the points of all of this. These are people. Like, there are over 50 photographers in this exhibition, and I know 44 of them personally. And the 6 I don't know personally were known to someone I know personally. So drawing that map of Steve Barron has handwritten notes from Barbara Morgan still blows my mind. I still can't fully grasp those things as humans. And Miner met Alfred Stieglitz, and Edward Weston met with Alfred Stieglitz. And obviously Alfred Stieglitz and Paul Strand knew each other and each other's wives. We're not going there today. Bruce Davidson, who is in this room, his daughter Anna Mia Davidson is in the book room. And those things just, they continue. And so while there is very important aesthetic elements to everything that's here, I will say one thing on that. I didn't choose everything that's here because many of the photographs were given to me. And so Bruce's horse, the Welsh pony, very famous photograph. I've never loved the Welsh pony. I dearly love Bruce Davidson. Bruce loves that photograph. He has a mural print of it in his apartment in New York. It's giant. He loves that photograph. And actually, my relationship to that photograph when it's giant is very different. I kind of love it giant too. But the fact that he chose to give me that photograph is the gift that keeps on giving to me. Because I have to learn to like it. Or I have to learn to appreciate something in it. And that, for me, is where it is about relationship and not just about the experience of liking or not liking a pretty image.
Well, appreciating that he gave you a photograph that he loved. Do you know what I mean? And I just like, oh, here's a print I'm going to give Michelle for. It's something I dearly love. It's a print, it's a photograph I dearly love.
Yes.
Right?
And actually, when we think about the photographs I have chosen, like giving Buffalo Falling to my now ex-husband as a wedding gift, like maybe that wasn't the best metaphor. I shouldn't be trusted to choose my own photographs. Yeah. I mean, I think that exchange when you've worked on something with someone, there is an exchange there. And being able to have that, like Mary Ellen was always very generous in saying, like with this project, she asked me what I wanted. And she said it could be from this series. This is the Pride Parade. It's kind of in the middle of the wall square format here. She said it could be from this series, which was a commission that we had developed that summer, or something else. And like deep down inside, what I really wanted was Sweetie from the Indian Circus.
I was going to say, but you chose this instead?
Well, I didn't know how to ask for that. That felt like, I mean, she said it, but speaking of contentious people, this was also Mary Ellen.
Right.
Right? I didn't want to be greedy. And I did have that on a postcard. I still have it on a postcard, so, you know, I have it in some form. But what I ended up doing was choosing 3 prints from the series that we had worked on together and asked her to choose the final. And that way, I was guaranteed to end up with something that I wanted. It was a little of the Michael Hoffman negotiation. I hadn't thought about that until just now, but it was like, okay, here's 2 options and I'm happy with either one. And in that way, it wasn't just me saying, oh, I want this, but knowing that I would end up, and I was curious to see what she would choose. And that photograph is very different from everything else in that little photo essay that she had done. So it was interesting to me that she chose that one. What else do you want to talk about? Original photographs versus reproduction in books.
Go for it.
So Steve Barron's role at Aperture, my role was, when I was hired to use the Macintosh computer that had just been obtained in 1996. That was really my role. It was not, there were maybe some other words around it, but nobody really, this was like this box that we knew was important. Nobody quite knew what to do with it. Steve knew that we needed one. He got one, and then he hired me and said, you're gonna work on that. And then said, we need a website. Which we did. In the next year, we launched Aperture's first website in 1997. Which relates, actually, to the notion of an original print, reproduction of a print in book form, and then, of course, fast forward almost 30 years, all of the ways in which photographs exist in the world. But photography, for me, was a physical object. That is how it was introduced to me. When we were making books or an issue of the magazine was a little bit different. With the books, we usually had a box of prints. And we looked at those prints. We often laid the book out with those prints. And then the prints were locked up in a vault. Aperture's building at East 23rd Street was a former funeral parlor. And so it had these very nice, long, 6-foot shelves, as it turns out, with a big bank door. That was the vault. That's where the prints would be stored. And then you didn't handle the original prints until the book was going to the printer. So there would be this like intense experience at the beginning of the process where you get to see these beautiful objects. And then you worked with really bad photocopies or slides or some version for like 6 to 18 months. And then the book would be prepared to go to the printer and the prints would come back out and we would physically measure all the prints to size them for reproduction. So if you're dealing with 11 by 14 prints, darkroom photographers in the room know, no matter how good you are, your prints are not square. So every print had to be measured top and bottom, left to right, take the smaller of the two, then determine what was being cropped out, and if it was more than a 32nd of an inch, call the photographer, are you okay with cropping? If you're not okay with cropping, now we've got to silhouette the edge of the image. How do I have to adjust the X height on the page to account for that? So it was very physical, it was very manual. And I loved that because I just got to stare at photographs, writing down calculations and doing a lot of math. And then it changed. And I feel like it changed pretty quickly. Like in 1996, we were handling prints. And then in 2006, we weren't. And I missed that. I think that's actually maybe when work on the walls became more important. Because photographs were on a screen. And were files, and they were dissipating.
Is that the Barbara Morgan that over there, is it the one that has the crease in it, or is it yeah. See, that's something I love dearly about the actual print, is when there's like weird imperfections, or when you just nail them on the wall and then you start seeing its scars and its life that it has, like that Barbara Morgan, which I just love that is it a crease in it?
Oh, there's so many things wrong with that print.
Yeah.
No, I mean, there's actual dents, there's at least 2 creases, the mat's covering up some of the damage. That was the very first photograph I ever purchased. There was this print, and then another print from the same Lamentation, or no, it's not from the Lamentation series, it's the Big Kick, Edge of the World. And that print was in better condition, but it was not stamped. And this print was in terrible condition, but it was stamped with the studio stamp on the back of it. And a woman who was working at Aperture at the time, somebody had come to her and said, hey, I have these, and I want to sell them together. And $150 for me when I was 24 years old was a lot of money. And I was living on the Upper West Side, and Aperture was on 23rd Street. So in the summertime, I could walk that, but in the wintertime, that was a bit of a slog. And so I started calculating like my food budget, because rent is not flexible, and the subway fare was not flexible. So like food was the only kind of thing I could play with. And I was like, okay, well, if I only ate rice and lentils for this period of time, I could like accommodate this $150 expense. And so and then the idea, because Barbara was one of the founders of Aperture, so knowing that, I didn't know anything about her work, but just the fact that she was one of the founders of Aperture, and this was an original print that Steve would have totally rejected. Like, no, go back to the studio. Get a pristine print. She did. I mean, I don't know if she did, but it was stamped from her studio. And so I gave the good one to my sister, and I kept this one.
Cool.
And she had hers conserved and cleaned and, I don't know, treated to not fade further. And I was like, no one's gonna ever want this. I can't break it, it's already broken. So I can hang it for as long as I wanna hang it for, which thus far has been 25 years.
Yeah.
We've been talking to people for not quite 45 minutes, but close. Can we talk about books for a moment? What do books mean to you?
What do books mean to me? Books was everything for me when I started making photographs. It's how I taught myself how to make a photograph. It's how books were everything to me when I started making photographs, because it's how I taught myself how to make a photograph. It was how I learned about photography. It's how I taught myself. And so they were kind of everything to me in a certain way. Does that answer your question?
I mean, I came to photography because of books. Like, I loved books, all kinds of books, any kind of book. I thought the only way you could be a part of books was to write books, so I started writing books when I was 5, maybe earlier. And then to learn that there were picture books, like, why do they take the picture books away from us? Like, they start us at a very young age on pictures. That's how you learn how to read. You start reading pictures. And then they get you onto the words, and then they don't ever return you to the pictures. It's terrible. I go into high schools now to teach kids how to read picture books. So I was at Bard College. I was studying literature. I started a yearbook there because I hadn't had one for a while. And one of my professors, my religion professor actually, was like, the college publications office makes some really beautiful objects. You should go learn to work with them. And Ginger Shore, who was the wife of Stephen Shore, very important color photographer and teacher, Ginger finally agreed that I could substitute for the intern they really liked, but he was out on Christmas vacation or something, and so they were like, well, when Hugh comes back, you're out the door. But while Hugh is gone, you can get our coffee. And that was the most important job an intern could do, was coffee and bagels and getting everybody's bagel order right and coffee order right. And so I was coming back from getting the cafeteria and getting coffee and bagels, and I walked in, and there was a William Wegman photograph, a mock-up of a cover of the alumni magazine. William Wegman did not go to Bard, by the way, so of course it's logical that he was on the cover of the alumni magazine. Many photographers made their way to the alumni magazine, no relationship to Bard, but Ginger liked their work and wanted to make sure more people saw them. And so I walked in, and they were talking about whether the title of the magazine should be brighter or darker than the brightest or darkest hue in the photograph. And this conversation extended on for what felt like forever, but it was probably 20 minutes to half an hour. And I was completely fascinated. Like, I didn't really understand what they were talking about, but I did understand the visual relationship that they were talking about. And it was just this moment of like, I don't know what this is, but I want to do this. I want to have these conversations. And the notion that actually we were reading all of these books in my literature classes that were typeset in fonts that someone chose, and that there were margins that someone had made a decision about, and some of those books were nicer to read than other books were. It felt like this very wonderfully subversive act. Like, we can subtly manipulate everyone in the world based on margins and typefaces. Sign me up. And that, I mean, I already loved books. So the idea that there was this other thing that you could do in the making of the book just became everything. I mean, to the extent that I then found this publishing program and went into the publishing program and have, by some ridiculous miracle, managed to stay 30 years in working in publishing, which feels very, very important. I had to start my own company, to be honest, to continue this last 12 years, but the making of the considered making of books, which again goes back for me to Steve Barron and really understanding the book as a cultural object, the book as a sacred object, the book as something that should outlive us and speak for us, speak for the photographer.
That's what I was going to say. Like, as a photographer, it's like the highest ideal really is or the highest like idea of success, or at least it was for me, was to have a book, you know what I mean? Because of what they meant to me, and two, just that it lives on in a form that is accessible and not necessarily in somebody's drawer or somebody's wall or, yeah.
Well, and it's funny, particularly as I look around this room, because I made this decision that like I could afford to own books, but I couldn't afford to own prints. Because framing prints is really expensive. And so all I can tell you is, having made that decision, you can only imagine how many books I have. Because this was somewhat accidental. And I also want to acknowledge, because it is important and it is a distinction between the book and this exhibition. 2 years ago, Steve Barron's wife, Carol, Steve died in 2010. Carol Barron passed away in 2023. She was a legacy publisher of Minor Matters, as is Ken and Debbie, had remained in my life and very supportive of my life in photography, which was a really special gift. And when she passed away, I offered to Ken to help deal with the rest of the photographs, as I had offered to Carol previously. And he said, oh, great, when I get to that point, I will thank you for your kind offer. When I get to that point, I'll be in touch. And then maybe 2 months goes by, and he said, hey, actually, you got named in the will, so I need your address. The attorney needs to send you some paperwork. And all I could think of, Chris and Janet heard the story, all I could think of was Carol had chosen one minor white photograph for me. And I was really touched, so touched. And then I got a copy of the will. And it said that Carol was leaving the remainder of her art and photography to me. And I did not feel quite the same way when I read that line, because I knew how much there was. And I was much more interested in helping Ken and Debbie. And so it has been an important process to receive that gift. And this exhibition is a celebration of that gift. There are a number of pieces here that you all would not get to see if it were not for Carol's decision to make that gift. And it's been a process to work through what one does with all of these objects. And I am working on 2 library donations so that prints and books that Steve worked on can be in a permanent collection. So the Stephen A. Barron photo book collection will exist at the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley.
Cool.
And there will be a selection of Aperture books and prints and some Minor Matters books and prints that will live there. And we are in discussion with an East Coast institution to have a similar set of prints reside on the East Coast. And that goes back to histories and legacy, so that future generations, when we are having conversations about books, have an opportunity to see how we made them and the objects that we spent hours poring over to try within book form to approximate the experience of a print. It's never going to be the same. And allowing for the reality that it's never going to be the same, but that we can try, has been what Steve taught me. He kept trying to retire and couldn't quite find someone to take his place, but the person I remember the most was this young man that Steve was really, he grew up in a printing family, and he was like, this guy, he's the guy. And so he started working at Aperture. He was there for about 3 months, and he resigned, and the last line of his resignation letter said, I just don't want to agonize over every decision. And Steve comes out of his office and he reads this out loud to us. And we all sat there for a moment and we're like, but that's the best part. Questions, comments, thoughts? Anything else you want to say? Yeah.
What are some of your favorite photography?
Books. Mirrors, Messages, Manifestations, high on the list. Minor White, 1969. Larry Fink's Social Graces. That was the first book I held where I was looking at the paper and the printing and the typography and all the things. Sylvia Plahy's Unguided Tour. Ward 81. Every book I worked on that's represented here, to be honest. There are many books I worked on that are not represented here. Oh, we're being filmed. Sorry all of you who I've worked with that I didn't choose your book. No, I mean, it was interesting to pull books for this exhibition There were some that came to mind immediately. There are 3 that I thought I was going to put in this that are not here because I realized I only had 1 copy left. And so I'm sorry, you don't get to see them because I wasn't willing to part with my 1 copy of the book. Shooting Blind, there's a piece on the wall next to the Stonehenge by Paul Caponegro that is by a visually impaired photographer. Shooting Blind was a very important book to me, and one that I still enjoy looking at. The books that I love looking at definitely influence the way that I make books, and my goal is that really, if it's something that's from 20 years ago or something that is from last year, that your experience of it should transcend time.
What were the 3? The 3 you didn't bring?
Eleanor Carucci's Closer, 2nd edition. My friend Alan Rapp edited the 1st edition. I edited the 2nd edition. So Eleanor's print is back there, but the corresponding book is not. Shooting Blind, I did not bring that book. Actually, Taking Aim, I found a copy at Powell's. So that one is there. That is a collection of music photographs that Graham Nash, it was an exhibition that Graham Nash curated. Music photography is a running theme throughout my life, and bringing it sort of out of the ghetto and into the light, and allowing it to live equally among other forms of photography, which was something that I experienced at Aperture of photojournalism kind of being pulled forward. So yeah, and then there's every single book I've published through Minor Matters is one of my favorite books. Like, I started Minor Matters to own Alice Wheeler's non-existent book, to own Joe Park's non-existent book, to own Carbon in book form. I couldn't afford any of Isaac Lehman's work, so I had to make a book with him because that was the only way I was gonna own it. So yes, all of those books are my favorite books. Black Panthers. Jennifer Stutes. Hi, friend.
Thank you for being here. So you touched on very briefly your visual literacy workshop with high schoolers. Would you indulge the audience with your initial experience? There was a 2-day workshop you did.
At PCW?
Maybe, but I think it would be very illuminating to what you are observing among youngsters.
So the premise of the workshops I teach on reading photographs came from Walter Chappell, Nathan Lyons, and Minor White in a 1957 issue of Aperture, and the editorial is called On the Neglect of Visual Literacy. Minor basically posits that photographers are terrible at looking at photographs and need to be taught how to look at photographs, and says actually that editors are marginally better, but only marginally. And the methodology that was set up was really for photographers to look at each other's work. The simplified version of that I developed was really about how we step outside of how our brains read images, because our brains read images very differently than it reads abstractions, which are letter form. So your first response to an image is it's bypassing your reasoning and it's going straight into a memory association. And that memory association is either positive or negative. And from that place, it's going in to the dinosaur part of your brain. Like, should I stay here? Should I run away? Or should I attack this? And because of that, within about 90 seconds in any given photograph, if you ask someone to describe to you, anyone over the age of about 8, if you say, tell me what you see, they will state an opinion as fact. And believe that it's fact, without understanding that they're bringing their own personal interpretation to it. And so when I discovered this, it was kind of mind-blowing for me and was something that I've spent the last 15 years now researching further, and I've met with brain scientists and researchers to kind of confirm my dumbed down version of very smart information. But the workshops that I teach with the students is to show them a photograph, ask them to start with their basic associations and their timed exercises. Then I show them the same photograph and say, tell me just what you see. And then the third timed viewing is, tell me your opinions, what you like or don't like. If you have questions, what is the context? High school students and most adults can have an entire 60 minutes of discussion about photography and never once ask themselves who the photographer is. Because our brains read most photographs as a relationship to the world. And we don't ask ourselves who we are when we are in the world. And so photography sort of replicates a lived experience. And as a result of that, people just place themselves within it without thinking about who has mediated your experience. And it's a fascinating process to go through. People get angry because anytime you're trying to teach your brain to function in a way it doesn't want to function, it doesn't like that and resists it. But it has been, I have used the book, I designed Seeing Being Seen to be able to cover up any of the text. So you can just look at the photograph and spend time discussing the photograph without any other context. And then bringing in who the photographer is, when it was made, who's in the picture, and kind of extending the information beyond that. Did that sort of answer your question?
Well, yes, it lays the groundwork. I remember you speaking about one workshop in particular where the youngsters, you started with digital images, which of course is their quotidian. It is what they engage with literally every hour of every day. And then the next day you brought in books, and how that visceral experience created such a shift in these youngsters who traditionally just look at their screens.
Yeah.
Was that magic that I was remembering?
It's been interesting to teach people how to read books again, and the slowing of that process. It was really fun to have a conversation about this photograph that's right behind Adrain, because I had a class of 25 students discussing the color of the coat. None of them knew that it was me. None of them read that as a photograph of me. They were completely obsessed with the color of the coat. And I finally, in a moment of like a mild bit of frustration, said, I happen to know the coat is gray because I was wearing the coat. I owned said coat we're discussing. And then they all went, oh my God, that's you. Which was this marvelous moment where we'd spent 3 days at that point talking about reading a photograph, but their ability to connect an actual human standing in front of them. They never noticed that I was on the cover of the book, ever. Their teacher finally said, turn to the cover of the book. Look at the person on the cover of the book. Now look at the person standing in front of you. And like, granted, Will Wilson's, it's an amazing photograph, and I am not wearing my glasses, and there's a lot of things, but their ability to completely disassociate humanity from anything else that they were dealing with was really, was fascinating. Yeah. You've all been very patient. Are there other questions? Yes?
Something that just popped into my head as relates to that was I went out in Central Oregon. A friend of mine had a giant telescope, and he showed me the rings around Saturn. And I remember all of that hit me in that moment as I watched the glimmer of the light that was hitting my eye that had bounced off of Saturn.
Yeah.
Thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
And then I realized I had never seen Saturn except for a representation in a book or on TV
Right.
or in anything. But now I was looking
You were
at
having,
actual Saturn with my eyeball.
yeah.
That whole disconnect that you have been talking about, where we as consumers of visual things, books in this case, we're not used to looking at the objects that are in that book.
Correct.
We're so removed from it that if that person is standing in the room with us, we tend not to even notice that that person is the actual person on the cover of this book until it's pointed out to us.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. You're so right. And how crazy that, yes, with your own eyeball, you can see Saturn.
Yeah, it's a place.
Yeah.
I feel like in this rare moment in conclusion, I don't know when you and I and she are going to be in the same space together. So I feel
Okay.
like we should talk about her.
Okay. As you speak of her in the third person,
She is in the third person now.
someone you used to be.
So there was long conversation in whether or not this photograph would be in my book. I had my beloved elder ladies saying, absolutely, in no way, shape, or form should you publish this image anywhere. So my happy medium was that in the book, this photograph is in what's called a gatefold. So you can flip through this entire book and not see this photograph unless you choose to open it. My very good friend Roger Gorman, who's an amazing book designer, called me when he got his copy of the book. He had co-published it. And he said, were you going for like a Playboy centerfoldy thing? I was like, only a graphic designer would ask me that question. No. Have you noticed that the photograph is in fact not in the middle of the fold out? He was like, well, why would you go to the expense of doing this and not use the space, says the graphic designer. I said, so I can tear it out of my mother's copy of the book. And he's like, you're kidding, right? I am absolutely not kidding. He's like, you spent $1,000 to be able to tear a page out of your book. I said, that's correct. Honestly, I've been thinking I could have just razor bladed her out, but Sylvia Plahy, this print's on the other side. I would have lost another picture that's important. It was better to spend the money and be able to just rip that page right out. And funny story, my mother saw my original copy of the book and saw the picture anyway. So it turns out I wasted $1,000 for no good reason. Adrain and I made this photograph in 2012. I was going through a divorce, and I was very sad. And you invited me to spend a weekend making pictures, my idea of an absolute nightmare. Why did you ask for the mirror?
Originally, I don't even remember. I said I'm trying to remember why I asked for the mirror. So at the time, I was doing these camps along with a Native American ritualist, Timothy White Eagle, and we would get together, a group of people, and we would have a general theme in which we'd work on, like the sacred hunt or AIDS, or this camp was called the death of false optimism. And because I was like 40 or something, and I was hanging out with 20-year-olds, and I was sort of coming towards a midlife crisis and realizing that I was sort of a part of the last generation that had a sense of false optimism that everything will work out fine, and that I was around these 20-year-olds and they've always had something traumatic about to happen to them, to their world is about to be destroyed. And so we got together a group of people and we would work by like creating a ritual with the idea that the photograph that we create from the ritual is the spell that goes out into the world. And so, other than I really wanted to shatter the mirror,
Yes.
maybe is why I asked for it.
So this mirror is quite large, was quite large, and it hung over my fireplace, reflecting nothing, reflecting another part of the ceiling. It was given to me by my aunt and uncle, who I loved very much. I did not want the mirror. I get given things. I'm realizing I get given things. So I was given this mirror along with some furniture that I did want, and they were like, oh, the mirror goes with the furniture. It's a package deal. So this mirror had been reflecting nothing for a while. Adrain was like, oh, hey, can I have the mirror? Like, my entire life is falling apart, and you were asking, he was like, well, you seem to be like very disassociated. Why not just keep going with that? And so I said, yes, you can take it. It has to come back to me in some form of a work of art. And I said, and I don't want to be part of breaking it. The Irish, Burmese, Indian juju was heavy on the not breaking of the mirror. So, and I said, and I don't want to stay overnight. And you're like, look, you have to stay at least one night. I think some people were staying 3 nights. I was like, I will stay 1 night. So we get over there, and this mirror is propped up on a deck, and all the beautiful 20-somethings are getting themselves ready in the mirror. And I'm realizing that this is the first time this mirror has served its purpose in over a decade. And so that was kind of an amazing moment. And then there's a beautiful ritual, and the mirror gets carried down to the beach, and the sunset, and all this stuff, all this wonderful stuff is happening. And I'm there, and then the person who's been chosen for this moment of breaking the mirror steps onto the mirror and has like some stiletto heels on. It's a whole thing that's great, and the mirror doesn't break. And we're all standing there, and we're like, okay. And so she like stomps on it again, and the mirror doesn't break, and she stomps on it a 3rd time. And now we just start laughing, right? Because it's like this very like sacred moment. The mirror is actually resisting the next phase of its life. So then everybody jumps on the mirror. I did stay outside of the circle, but I enjoyed watching everyone jump on the mirror. It finally shatters. And many things got made that weekend. There's a photograph in I Have Something to Tell You of Adrain wearing a crown of the shards of glass. So that night I had a dream that I dreamed this. I had to dream of this moment. And the young people were completely fascinated with the idea of marriage, totally didn't understand any sadness that I was feeling at the end of marriage. They were like, why would you ever commit to someone for life in the first place? Why would that even occur to you? And now you're sad? You're free! Be free! I'm like, that's not how I feel. But good to hear your perspective. And so we'd had all these conversations, and so I go to Adrain and I'm like, okay, I'm leaving today, but I need you to make a picture with me. And he's like, oh, tell me about it. And I described this to him, and he says, that doesn't sound very interesting.
I didn't say that out loud.
You did too. You did.
I did not. That is not something I would ever say.
It might have been, that doesn't sound very interesting. So we go down to the beach, and we're trying all these different things. The mirror's propped up. I had this black dress on. I'm stepping into the mirror. We're doing all this stuff with the mirror. And finally, I'm like, can we just do the thing that I wanted to do? You made me come out here. Can we just do this thing? And while I was very scared, I also felt very empowered. And Fox had come down. So Adrain's in the water, I'm up on the beach, and so I take my dress off, and the sand was really cold, and I'm like, oh, I'm so strong, look at me, totally afraid of my own body, but here I am. And I did not realize that my face was turned entirely away from the camera. And so Fox, who was also there for the weekend, said, Michelle, face us. And this is the only frame, right, where my eyes are open.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't see this for like 3 months. But then you sent it to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I need that as big as possible.
And you put it on your wall, right?
I did. Because I felt so strong, and I look at that photograph and I feel so broken.
Mm.
Because I was broken. But so many other people see different things in it.
Mm. Well, that's photography.
And that's
art.
photography.
And that's photography. True.
Good job.